Lecture 1.2, Creating a Common Vocabulary, an Institutional Definition of Capitalism. Like poverty, the term capitalism carries a great deal of baggage that we'll have to unload in order to have a productive discussion of whether capitalism is a boon to the poor. The purpose of the second part of Lesson 1, then, is to continue to construct a common vocabulary. While our discussion of poverty focused on widely used and accepted definitions and measures, our definition of capitalism will depart from the common and often loaded definition of the term implied in everyday speech and in the traditional presentation used in economics courses. The standard textbook definition of capitalism is a market economy in which the means of production are privately owned. Seems pretty straightforward, but if you try to apply the definition to your knowledge of different countries of the world, it raises more questions than it answers. For example, must all the means of production be privately owned? They aren't in the United States. What about things like mass transit, mail delivery, education, and highways? Does that mean the U.S. isn't capitalist? The Soviet Union allowed peasant farmers to grow their own vegetables and sell them in local markets. But wasn't the Soviet Union communist? And what about China today? Equally unsatisfactory is the model of capitalism many of us learned in college economics courses entitled Comparative Systems. The course content was typically an extended comparison contrast of capitalism, communism, socialism, and perhaps fascism, each presented as a discrete system with unique features. Even during the Cold War, it was clear that the laboriously constructed models of systems didn't fit the real world, where most economies are in fact mixed. In the complexity of the 21st century, the dividing line between systems grows ever more blurry. In addition to U.S. capitalism, we hear references to Chinese capitalism, Western European capitalism, the capitalism of the former Soviet republics, and even dictator-based capitalism in Africa. We propose, then, to replace the systems model of capitalism with an institutional definition, meaning that we'll identify the specific institutional components of capitalism and then analyze the characteristics of those components in particular contexts. Recognition of the importance of institutions in economic analysis is credited to economic historian Douglas North, who was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1993. His work leads us to conceive of capitalism as a set of institutions governing the production and exchange of goods and services. In these lessons, we will find that the institutional elements of capitalism are present in almost all nations, but their manifestations vary widely among nations with different consequences for the poor. Before we delve into the specifics of the various institutions, some conceptual background development is in order. Douglas North has referred to institution as the, quote, rules of the game, a pithy summary that strikes a chord of recognition in modern society. Institutions are the established behavior practices and patterns upon which the life of a community is built. They're the fixtures of our interactions with other people. Institutions may be formal or informal. Constitutions, charters, statutes, contracts are formal codifications of the rules of interaction. While the importance of formal institutions cannot be overstated, it's also important to remember that informal institutions, the accepted and expected patterns of interaction, may actually be more powerful. North points out that formal institutions like laws are subject to change. But informal institutions develop over time and thus tend to persist and change very, very slowly. As such, they exert even more influence over our behavior than formal institutions. Think, for example, of the failures of historical attempts to shape behavior through law, when the law did not reflect informal but deeply ingrained cultural and social norms. How do institutions work? Well, if you've had even a little economic education, you'll be happy to find yourself back on familiar ground. Institutions influence behavior because they shape incentives. And one of the first things you learned in economics is that people respond to incentives in predictable ways. That is, they respond to positive incentives by doing more of an activity that earns them the offered reward, and they respond to negative incentives by doing less of an activity for which they suffer a punishment or loss. Recognizing the power of incentives and the role of institutions in shaping incentives allows us to explain patterns of behavior without resorting to vague references to historical forces or culture. North pointed out, for example, that if a nation's institutions reward some particular activity, say with tax breaks, then people would have an incentive to engage in that activity, and more people of all cultural and social backgrounds would do so. This doesn't mean that institutions affect all people equally. They're rarely neutral in their impact. Tax laws that reward home ownership, for example, affect landlords differently than home builders, and home builders differently than real estate agents. This brings up an important caveat, something we probably all know intuitively, but which still bears articulating. Nations have political institutions as well as economic institutions, and they affect each other. Whether we like it or not, economic institutions are influenced and constrained to some degree by political and governmental institutions. Since we know that institutions may create advantages or disadvantages for particular groups, we shouldn't be surprised to find that political parties, firms, trade unions, bureaucracies, lobbies often dedicate significant resources to trying to shape the rules of the game to their own benefit. One way to illustrate the variety of capitalist economies in institutional terms is to think of institutions as the threads in a nation's social fabric. Similar to cloth fabrics, which are constructed of interwoven threads of cotton, wool, or nylon, a nation's social fabric is constructed of interwoven institutional threads: economic institutions, political institutions, and social institutions. Suppose that a weaver only had wool. She could still spin the thread in different ways to give the fabric a unique look and feel. Similarly, capitalist institutional threads can take on a variety of forms, depending on how they are spun by culture, government, history, etc. Thus, we tend to see a continuum of institutional practice rather than discrete categories or systems. Consider the institution of markets, for example. Hong Kong, China, Canada, France, and the United States have markets, but the competitiveness and ease of entry into those markets differs greatly. So too do the number and type of products exchanged in markets. In Hong Kong, almost all goods and services are provided through virtually unregulated markets. In Canada, most, but not all products, think healthcare, are provided in markets. France, where not only healthcare but most forms of communication and transportation are provided by markets, is further along the continuum. And closer to the end is China, where markets provide a few agricultural and manufactured goods. The historical record tells us that these differences in institutional forms matter. Some forms of capitalism help to alleviate poverty, and others do not. Thus, in discussing whether capitalism is good for the poor, we're better served by referring to the following four specific capitalist institutions rather than capitalism as a discrete system. Clearly defined and secure property rights, including individuals' rights to themselves and their possessions. A prevailing rule of law within a framework of limited government. Note that democracy is not a sufficient condition here. Open, competitive markets where interaction creates an ethic in which individuals' choices have consequences. And finally, entrepreneurship, which is fostered by incentives to invent, innovate, and produce. In the classroom activity, Will the Real Capitalism Please Stand Up, that accompanies Lesson 1, students use data, stories, and observations to determine how well their assigned nation's institutions live up to the standard articulated in the list of the. As they do so, they not only gain awareness of economic conditions in other countries, but they also become comfortable thinking about and discussing capitalism in terms of an institutional spectrum rather than a discrete system. Please work through the assignment lessons for the Creating a Common Vocabulary unit, and then we'll begin our examination of the institutions of capitalism by introducing you to Hernando de Soto and his crusade to identify and secure property rights for the poor.